So I'm joined today by somebody who I've followed extensively after I read this book called Stringing Rosaries, The History, the Unforgivable, and the Healing of Northern Plains American Indian Boarding School Survivors by Dr. Denise Lajimodiere. And she is not only a scholar and an educator, but she's also an artist. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lajimodiere. I'm going to call you Denise if that's okay.
Dr. D. Denise is fine.
Dr. D. There you go. So I would just wanted to start by maybe introducing yourself and how you came to the subject of boarding schools.
Yes. Juanin, Wabishkabane, Sawana Kwatikwe, Dejanakaz, Shijak Nadodem, Nikanakwaju, Nindunjiba. So my tribal name, several of them at Morningstar and White Thundercloud Woman. My clan is Crane, and I am from the Turtle Mountains in north central North Dakota. So what did you ask now? You asked how I came to do boarding school research. Yes, I'd interviewed my parents, my father mostly extensively because my mom died when I was fairly young, but I still have a couple of her stories. And I also interviewed my grandfathers. And then when I became a professor, my dissertation, one of the themes that came from my dissertation, I interviewed women, Native women, and their path to leadership. And one of the themes that bubbled up to the top was all of them had been boarding schooled. And so I decided to do a qualitative research interview with boarding school survivors. And I put information in the newspapers, and they volunteered to tell me their story, whether it was a positive story or a negative story. But most of the people that contacted me, the survivors, were older. They were 50, 60, 70, and my uncle was in their 90s and my auntie in her 90s. They mostly had some pretty horrific stories to tell. So it's mostly from my mom was sent to Stephan in South Dakota and to Wapton, where she ran away. I just got her records from the archives in Kansas City. My father, though, his story is pretty much more horrific. He was hidden by the parents, the elders that were raising him after his mother died in the 1918 flu epidemic. And they hid him from the Indian agent in Belcourt there. They would tell him to run and go and hide in the bush. But he was threatened. They were threatened, of course, that if they didn't send him, they would take their rations away or throw him in jail. So he ended up being sent to Chemawa, Oregon from North Dakota. 6 of them were sent, along his sister, and 4 others were sent. They were the second group of kids in 1925 to be sent to Chemawa, Oregon. So since then, I've looked into his records and his report card, and he didn't speak a word of English when he got there. So the first 6 months, the part that says the English is blank. Of course, he was beaten for not speaking English. They put lye soap in their mouths for not speaking English. He was nearly killed in something called the gauntlet. He still had the physical scars. Mama also didn't speak a word of English when she was sent to the school in South Dakota. And she was locked in a closet by the nuns and made to kneel on broomsticks until she learned English. So that's what started my interest in wanting to start recording boarding school stories.
And, this is a really difficult topic, and I just want to kind of give listeners a fair warning that some of the things that we're going to be talking about, are traumatic. And we want to handle this with care and respect and, dignity for those who have survived, but those who have, been preyed upon in this particular system. So before we get into kind of the particulars of the boarding school experience, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your methodology, not just in the book, but in the way that you have done oral histories with boarding school survivors and the care and the kind of spiritual kind of aspect of caretaking these particular stories.
I think I had an in because when I went to visit with them, I would go to their home. I wouldn't make them come out to an office. I would travel to South Dakota. Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota. I would travel to their homes where they were comfortable. Some of them weren't comfortable in their homes. We went to another room outside their home, or we went even to a restaurant at one time because they didn't want their family to hear the stories that they were telling. So I would offer tobacco, and I also brought gifts. None of that, of course, was funded by the university. They didn't know how to fund something like that, or they couldn't. But anyway, so I would offer gifts and tobacco, but I also would tell them that my parents were boarding school survivors. So I think that helped them become more comfortable with me and helped them to share their stories. So that's it. And then for their emotional help, I would ask them to seek out, if they weren't already in programs of recovery like AA or had sought therapy and grief therapy and PTSD, talk therapy, I would encourage them to do that. Since then, I had stopped interviewing when I interviewed a man from home, and he called me. He talked about sexual abuse, and he said, "I've never told anybody. I'm only telling you that he was sexually molested at Wapton boarding school." And he became suicidal, and that frightened me. And I happened to know the two psychologists, doctoral psychologists on the reservation, and I called one of them and I got him in within like 45 minutes. But I stopped interviewing for a couple of years after that because I am worried about the mental health. In Canada, I went up there and was an international observer for their truth-telling process up there. And there they had psychiatrists, psychologists, medicine people. They had a ceremony. They had paper bags that even the tissues of your tears were put in there and then put into the sacred fire. And even after they left for a week after, they kept mental health people in that community in case there's more triggers. So I have to be real careful if I continue to do more interviews to make sure that the people have follow-up healthcare and care after they tell their stories.
And just before we get started, are there any resources that you recommend people who are listening to check out?
Well, that's part of the problem. There aren't a whole lot of people trained that, psychiatrists, counselors, school counselors that are aware of boarding school trauma. So otherwise, Canada has some, they have a better information source, numbers and places to call where the United States doesn't. I think NABS, Boarding School Healing Coalition, might have a number up also that may be a number to call. Otherwise, they need to seek talk therapy. There's just general therapy for PTSD. So many of them, like I mentioned earlier, said that they didn't want their names put in the book. You'll notice that in the book. And that's because they had to go through hearing themselves, the trauma that they went through, and they didn't want their kids or grandkids to know and have to have that burden on themselves. So many of them only told their husbands. And one man wouldn't be interviewed at all. He said, my boarding school stories will stay right here. And we know that we're off, the saying is we're only as healthy as our secrets. So I think there's so many boarding school people out there that I said in the book, this resounding silence of boarding school survivors. But then Gerald Visner was out to dinner with him a couple of years ago, and he said, where do boarding school survivors tell their stories? When do they tell their stories? Do we sit at Thanksgiving table and go, oh, I was raped by a priest, for 5 years when I was in boarding school. So that really struck me. So a lot of these people, they said, I've never told anybody. I don't know why I'm telling you. And I told them, because I'm asking. So no one's ever sat down and asked, well, they have sat down and asked their parents and grandparents their boarding school stories, but many of them won't talk about it because it's still too traumatizing. So when they relive their stories and tell their stories, they're going into trauma again. And it can put the listener into secondary trauma. So we have to be very careful when we're recording stories. But like the Holocaust survivors, many of them that went through the horrors of the camps are dying. And I believe, their stories all need to be told so that the world never forgets. So what my boarding school survivors said, please tell the world our story. So I think NABS is looking at a way to interview more people, or people can go onto their website and tell their story. I don't want the world to ever forget what happened to my parents and my grandparents.
Deb Haaland recently issued a statement at the National Congress of American Indians announcing that her office would do, a federal investigation, or a Department of Interior-led investigation into federally run boarding schools. And the Catholic boarding schools may, we don't really know, but they may fall outside of that scope. And given the kind of the histories that have been written, I know that there was Education for Extinction that was written by David Wallace Adams, which gives a good overview of the kind of the early history of the federal Indian boarding school system. Why did you choose to focus specifically on Catholic boarding schools?
I did. I didn't focus. It's just those are the people that called me to interview them. But when I did in my map, the map that's in the back of the book. So what we're still looking at is what denomination ran those boarding schools. But the thing is like Fort Taunton, which is just down the road from me, that's a federal boarding school, but they also had the gray nuns go in and teach. So there's no separation of church and state. So, so the other denominations, there's also Methodist, Orthodox Friends, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Hicksite Friends, Baptist, Reformed Dutch Church, Congregationalists, Unitarians, and Lutherans. They all ran boarding schools. So like no one had ever asked the Catholic Church, how many boarding schools do you have? So some of the research I did when I was a professor and had the funds, I went to Marquette University and spent 5 days there looking through 35 boxes of their boarding school and day school. So I had to go through each very old records from the 1884 and decide, and it said boarding school or it said day school. So that's the type of research that still needs to be done with all the rest of these schools. The other one that has helped us is the Quakers. That's not on here. So the Quakers actually did their own research for NABS. So they've listed, so we have the Quaker boarding schools. There was a student somewhere on the East Coast that was going to an Episcopalian college up there. And she contacted me and she's given me a list of Episcopalian churches that she's been able to literally dig up through old records again. So we still need more research on more of these churches. And do I have every Catholic church boarding school? No. In the past week, since I put on Twitter and since I put on Facebook, I've had people inboxing me and messaging me about other schools. So since this map of 366 schools, I had found 20 more schools. And now in this past week, 4 more schools that aren't on here. So that's literally Canada knows exactly how many boarding schools I have. And when we sat there with the 3 commissioners at that working supper, Chief Justice Murray turned to me and he said, well, how many boarding schools do you have in the United States? And I'm representing, United States at that moment. Couldn't tell him. So I've made it sort of my life's mission to continue looking for as many boarding schools as I can find. And as you see, just in the last week, there's been 4 more that people have sent me that I go online and vet that, yes, it was a boarding school. And then to note what denomination ran them or if they were federal or not. So on Fort Taunton, there was the federal boarding school that, the nuns came in and worked on that. But just a few miles away in St. Michael's, there was a Catholic boarding school. And these were both on the reservations. And the Catholic boarding school, those kids still weren't allowed to go home for 9 months, even though they could see their home over there. And some ran away and tried to get to their homes. They weren't allowed to go home and parents weren't allowed to visit. So it's not just the Catholics. I don't think I didn't mean to just focus on them. It's just that those are the people that told me their story.
And in the book, it's quite, it's quite compelling to see the sheer magnitude of the boarding school system in each state. You have each state listed by the ones that you have identified. And not only have you identified them, but you also designate which ones are still in operation. And I think there's one on NABS that, is a little bit more kind of detailed, not just in operation, but those that still dorm as well.
Yeah, well, this one, like the dark ones are, and I may not have all of them. I thought there was only 54, but I was just listening to Christine speak earlier on another podcast. I think she said 78 are still operating, but those are, like Flandreau is still operating, Wahpeton is, Chemawa is still operating. And then there's a lot of schools in New Mexico and Arizona, but the kids there, they're 100 miles away from school. So they just board for the week and then get to go home. So they're in nowhere near what the schools were like in the 1920s to the 1970s. These are now usually run by the tribe or at least by tribal school boards. So they're not like what's happening here. They need, some of them that are run by the Bureau of Indian Education, like Chemawa, I mean, they just need more funding. Flandreau, Wahpeton, they still need more funding.
Let's talk a little bit about the history of, the boarding school system. I mean, in your book, you talk about in 1819, the creation of the Civilization Fund, which allocated money to go to boarding schools. Many of them were run by religious groups. And then in 1874, the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions formed to kind of administer these Catholic-run boarding schools. And then by 1891, I mean, in the midst of that, you have in 1879 the creation of Carlisle, which ran until 1918. But then in 1891, you have this kind of order coming from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that essentially makes it compulsory to go to schools. And if it's not compelling the students themselves, it's compelling the parents and the families by withholding, later on withholding in 1893, in order to withhold rations and withhold treaty annuities. What does this history of the 19th century tell us about the intent of boarding schools and their purpose?
Well, we know from the interviews that the total intent was absolute, complete assimilation. So it was the saying, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And then it was decided that it cost $1 million for every campaign to attempt a genocide, slaughter Native people. So Pratt came up with, I believe in that too, but I rather purport kill the Indian in the man and kill the Indian, save the man. So he liked Indians, but he hated the culture. He wanted them to completely assimilate into white European culture. So and he ran it military style. So he started Carlisle, the first federal off-reservation boarding school. There were a lot of mission schools in the early 1800s that were still on reservations also. But his issue was that, well, they can go right back home every night and keep the language and keep the culture and keep the traditions and the ceremonies. So he wanted them off reservation. So Pratt had a friend, Wilkerson, and he sent him out in 1880 out to Chemawa, Oregon, to start the boarding school there at Forest Grove. And then it moved a few miles south to Chemawa, Oregon. And that's where my father was sent in 1925. So it was harsh military style discipline. And he had to march with a little wooden gun. When he got older, it was with a metal gun. So they had details that they had to do. And they went to school half a day. And then because he became good at math, once he learned English, he became good at math. And even in the army, he was an army engineer up in the Aleutian Islands. And so they assigned him to carpentry. So he actually made a living for our family as a carpenter. But my father, to me, was a genius. He was brilliant. He was so smart. What could he have done if he wasn't encouraged to just have a sixth grade education there at Chemawa? Could he have gone on with his best buddy, Dave DeLorme, and gotten a doctorate degree and so on? So, so the schools were only encouraged to do manual labor type things, and the women were only encouraged to work in the kitchens and sew and laundry and knit and embroider, take care of a home. That's only what they were trained to do. So that was Pratt to force assimilation. And my dad said also he had to choose a church, and he said, we didn't eat. So again, forced Christianity. So Papa lost his language. He never spoke Cree again. My mom never spoke her language again, but my grandmother, who only had a third grade education, my mom's mom, she would talk our tribal language to my mom, and my mom would respond in English. but my dad he never spoke the language again. So my story, my family story, is just hundreds of thousands of Native people stories across the new country.
And at this particular time when, the boarding school system was implemented in the late 19th century, there was also an attempt to enforce things such as allotment and enforce, the kind of reservation order. So even on the reservations themselves, they had the civilization regulations where dancing was banned, where certain spiritual and cultural practices had been banned as well. So not only were the children going through it, the families themselves were also going through it back on the reservation.
Yes, we had our Sundance and our sweat lodge and shake tent. Our spirituality went underground, so they were still being held, but we had to hide it from the priest who would come and smash everything. He would even during Lent he would smash our fiddles so that we couldn't even dance or fiddle during Lent. But yes, our tribal spirituality, Made, we went underground during that area until like 1978.
And, your book really picks up the thread of boarding schools and the experiences of the survivors in the 50s, 60s, kind of at a time period when a lot of the kind of height, I guess, of the boarding school system, I believe in 1918 or 1920, I can't remember the exact date, at least 3/4 of Native children had gone to boarding schools, whether they were on the reservation or off the reservation. But the survivors and the survivor stories in your book really occur in the 50s and 60s. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and that time period. I know it probably has to do with just the fact that those people are still alive to share their stories, but it's very recent and it's not just something that's kind of in the past.
What I did when I interviewed, like say if I interviewed you, I would ask you about your life from the time you were born until you went to school. So I wanted to see all the different reasons that people were sent to boarding schools or went to boarding schools. So there's a lot of different reasons. Some were court ordered, some because we had become Catholic, especially on my reservation. They had up to 21 kids. They couldn't feed them. My grandfather abandoned the family. So my uncle and his 3 sisters, including my mom, they had to go to boarding school or they were hungry. So, and then some said, oh, my cousin's there, I want to go. So they didn't know that the hell that they were getting themselves into. So there were a lot of different reasons why in the 50s and 60s. Some were court ordered. One man said the social workers or the tribal police just came in and grabbed him. His mom was screaming and crying. They didn't even give them a chance to go to, an auntie and uncle or a grandma. They threw him in the car and loaded him up and sent him on down to Wapton. So that's the story of most of the boarding school survivors that went in the 50s and 60s. My uncle, he just passed away. He was 96 years old, and he was one that when Grandpa abandoned him was sent to boarding school because otherwise. And some of them said, well, things were so bad at home. We had a dirt floor. We lived in a log cabin. We were hungry. We had commodities. So when they went to boarding school, they had a warm bed and they had food. It was often slop. It had worms in it, and some of the meat was rotten. It was green and so on. And they had a shower. So then what I have to look at then is the historical trauma of what was going on in Indian country historically, that we were put on reservations and living in such poverty, are no longer free to hunt or fish and so on, that they lived in such poverty that the hellhole that boarding schools were a little bit better than what they were living at home. So you have to look at the historical trauma of what was going on history-wise during that generation.
Is there sort of you name out 5 kind of themes that emerge in your interviews, and I was wondering if we could talk maybe about some of the specific stories that are told according to these themes. And I kind of summarize them, and excuse me if they're a little bit too succinct, but I put them as loss, abuse, grief, inferior education, and healing. And the first one is loss, which is loss of culture, loss of language, loss of identity. Can you maybe extrapolate a little bit on that and kind of explain how that process occurred, and what specifically they were trying to remove from Indian people?
Well, the biggest loss to me was for my mom and my father, were that they lost their parents. So they lost any kind of parenting along with all of the culture and the language. And this is again extrapolated to hundreds of thousands of Native people. Where did our parents learn parenting skills? Well, they didn't. Papa was beaten with belts and with sticks and had to march with that wooden gun. Mama had to kneel on the wood floor and locked in closets. So how did they learn to parent me and my brother and sister? So they parented us the way they were parented in the boarding school. And again, that's so many generations. So me as an intergenerational, that not understanding for a long time until I started doing this research, what happened to my parents, and my father became alcoholic. And now I understand everything he went through, boarding schools, CCC camp, and then World War II. So he didn't learn to be a parent. So us kids were, whipped with a belt and made to kneel in the corner, not on a broomstick. But the biggest loss across any country to me is that so many of our parents and grandparents didn't learn how to be parents because they were boarding schooled. Papa was there for 4 years. That was the minimum that Pratt wanted him there. Mama, I don't know her records quite well. She passed away when I was 24 years old. So I'm still looking for her records. Haven't found her records at the Catholic boarding school yet. So I don't know how long she was at that boarding school, but I think every year and then come back. But they wanted them there for, up to 12 years. So they didn't know their parents, and they didn't know, what birthday parties, just think of everything besides the culture and the language, that these kids lost, that generation lost. So yeah, that's the greatest loss.
And the second one, is abuse. And this is, I mean, I'll be honest, when I read this book, I couldn't read it in a sitting. Like after every story, it was almost like devastating in terms of the impact that it had on me personally, just because I began to imagine and think about and really consider the things, like you had said, that I hadn't been told about my own family's experience, going to boarding school. Can you maybe talk a little bit about why abuse, why violence, why sexual abuse was such a kind of prolific aspect of a lot of these stories?
Well, you'd have to ask the nuns and the priests and the the headmasters and the matron, the dorm matrons. A lot of the abuse happened in the dorm because they had these kids available to them. That and for the discipline, I suppose it's just military style discipline. They would just, it's horrifying stories of heads getting smashed and ears getting ripped and smashed against the wall, and they had to go and clean up their own blood. I mean, it just goes on and on and on for both the residential schools and boarding schools in Canada, and it was the same discipline here. Canada had, I think it's the Davin, or is it the Blevin? There's a Davin report. Canada learned, they modeled their boarding schools after our boarding schools. They came down and met with our boarding school people in Washington, D.C., and someone said they toured Red Lake and they toured White Earth and possibly Haskell or Carlisle. So, the horrific abuses, I don't know if they just hired these people that were, what do you call them when they're so mean, and pedophiles. And a lot of them, of course, were, even the nuns, and both the nuns and priests molested the kids. It wasn't so much the teachers that did. The teachers they also did discipline the kids, but it seems like it was mostly the people that worked in the dorms with the kids that had free reign to go in and just pick the kids. They would just go in and grab them at night.
And what do you think? There's been movies that have been made about, Spotlight, for example, is about Catholic sexual abuse for children, I believe, in Boston. Why don't you think those kinds of stories, investigations are coming out about Indigenous people, if it was so prolific and it's so hegemonic in terms of our experience?
Well, there was the Zephyr family down in South Dakota. I'm not going to know the whole story, but they attempted to. But there's something called statute of limitations for the United States. Canada had a class action lawsuit And eventually there was something like $5 billion that were released for different healing programs. But here we have a statute of limitations. And the state legislature, and this is when NABS was still working with Native American Rights Fund, but even it just under the wire, the state legislature in South Dakota set up a law that you can't file suit against the Catholic Church after like 4 years. I may get that wrong. So that's part of it, is that we haven't been able to do a class action lawsuit, or we haven't been able to do lawsuits against the Catholic Church. I think there's a suit in Montana that may still be ongoing. I'm not sure, but they were able to do something differently up in Canada than we did. So they had, this billions of dollars. They had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. At the time when NAB started, we had like $5,000 to try to do nationally what Canada was able to do with $5 billion. So they've since gotten more monies, and I think they're looking for more researchers. So I'm really pleased. When I was so happy, I was crying when Deb Haaland talked about the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies Act. That's Elizabeth. Well, there's two of them. Elizabeth Warren, and then Elizabeth is to establish the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policy Act. That's Elizabeth Warren. Oh, and then the Secretary Deb Haaland, she's launching the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative to investigate Native American boarding schools. And I just was listening to her on another podcast also, and she was asked, similar to Canada, are we going to find unmarked graves here in the United States? And she said she didn't know. Well, I can tell her that, yes, you will. There's graves in San Diego Mission. This is just an example, Indian boarding school there. There are unmarked graves there. There are unmarked graves in Albuquerque. Forest Grove has 12 unmarked graves there at that boarding school. And then schools like Chemawa and Carlisle, they have grave headstones, but they're unknown. Chemawa, a researcher named Marcia Small, she took GPR years ago, and she saw unmarked graves also in Chemawa. So yes, and that's just a few schools that have popped up in the last week. So yes, we do have unmarked grave sites here in the United States at boarding schools. There was one of the men, I don't think it made it into the book, but Eugene talked about the St. Michael's boarding school there in Fort Taunton. For Catholics, if you're not Catholic, you don't get buried inside the fence. You get buried outside the fence. And he said that, and I think it's 4 kids are buried there, and they happen to be from Canada for some reason, but they weren't Catholic, so the church buried them outside the fence. And he said every now and then you can see little bones wick to the top. So I asked NDSU and UND for ground penetrating radar, and I couldn't find any. And then the pandemic hit, so I haven't been down there. Eugene wants to show me where they are. He said, I think there's little hills where we might find them. So I haven't pursued that yet. And I'm sure, I don't know if I'd have to get permission from the Catholic Church or also go to the tribal council. So those are just a few examples of unmarked graves of our babies that never made it home. And then the issue with, I tried to find the records, like the death records or the records of the kids that went to that school or what they died of. That's another big issue where we need more researchers to do that. I couldn't find it. I couldn't find the records. The church said, they burned. The tribe said, we don't keep those records. Marquette didn't have the records. So it's so frustrating to find out what happened to these babies that are buried there in unmarked graves. So there's more, I'm sure, across the United States. There's 29 states that I found that had, and I found one more state, I think Texas, one of the new boarding schools, PQRST. Yep, I don't have Texas. So there's 30 states now that I found just in the past week. That's the type of sort of agonizing research that needs to be done to try to find the history of boarding schools in the United States.
Yeah, and just to be clear, so the court case that happened or the lawsuit, I should say, that happened in 2010, just days before survivors from these Catholic-run boarding schools were set to go to court, the then Republican governor of South Dakota, Mike Rounds, who's now a U.S. senator, signed a bill into law which prohibited anyone 40 years or older from recovering damages from institutions like the church responsible for their abuse, except for individual perpetrators. And the act essentially crushed the lawsuits that were happening at the time and shielded the church from that kind of scrutiny. And just further kind of adding to this, the bill was actually written and proposed by Stephen Smith, the Chamberlain attorney, who was representing the Priests of the Sacred Heart, the founders of St. Joseph Indian School, in several sexual abuse cases at the time. And he accused on record the survivors as being motivated kind of solely by money, and costing the church undue expenses and legal fees. And I think it's also important to point out too how Canada went through this entire Truth and Reconciliation process. Millions of dollars were spent. Advertisements were put up, on television and in newspapers to hear stories. The final conclusions of the report were aired publicly, right? And the propositions for change were aired publicly as well. And so you couldn't, as an everyday Canadian, avoid the conversation around boarding schools, or residential schools, I should say. But one thing that is important to note, and this is something I found out from my friends up north, is that it was actually, the tribes, or excuse me, the First Nations who were funding these investigations, or these, the ones that resulted in the discovery of, at Kamloops, Maryvale, and there was another one, I can't remember exactly where it was. But it was the First Nations themselves who were doing the research on these particular schools. And it's like you had just said, the frustrations that you've encountered as a researcher, you would think that, there would be like, no pun intended, there'd be like a big Bible on boarding schools where you would go to and say, this is where they existed. This is the stories. This is the history. But just based on my own research, I've been frustrated, as somebody who's trained as a historian, and to go into these archives, there isn't much written. And it was actually incredibly painful when I first went to Carlisle to hear the stories about how, they wouldn't even send the remains of these children home. And sometimes, they would die out on outings, and they wouldn't know. And outings were basically lending the children out for labor to white families. And so there's just the extent. Carlisle is very notorious, but that's one school, That's
one school, and it only went to 1918. And Dr. Lou White is doing research on the outings and finding some of the graves of those kids that died on outings. So they were sent far from their home to Carlisle, and then they were sent from Carlisle to other towns around the states to, like you said, do this kind of labor. And then they died there, a lot of pneumonia and tuberculosis. So she's finding single lone graves in graveyards, and it's emotionally pretty traumatizing work. So she's having a tough time with just finding those. Again, that's just one little tiny research. Preston McBride, he also is doing research on how the kids died. So there's all these horrible diseases, TB and measles, trachoma, flu, that these kids just died of because they were in overcrowded dormitories. So why do we have graves? This is something that was sent to the superintendents, and it came out of an archivist in Pacific University studying about Forest Grove Boarding School and Chemawa. So this came from a letter that was sent to Washington D.C. for approval. So it says, notice should be given to the superintendents of Indian industrial schools that such expenses, i.e. paying for the sending home of children's remains, should not be incurred. And if incurred without proper authority thereof, they will be disallowed in their accounts. So if that was sent out to all industrial boarding schools, that's the big issue of not sending kids home, was because it cost too much money to send them home. I think of my father, if he would have died out there, his parents they wouldn't have been able to afford to send him home, and the school couldn't to send him, 3 days and 3 nights back on a train back to the reservation. So there's over 200 grave sites, I believe, at Chimawa alone, and you know too that Carlisle they're starting to repatriate. The families and tribes. I think with the war college there, you have to be a family member of one of the kids that are buried there, and then they will repatriate. So they've started again repatriating these babies back.
And some of the problems that they've run into there, though, is that these children didn't have any descendants. The families were essentially wiped out, and I think that was the case for Rosebud.
Yeah, so sad. And some of the other tribes just say that for their spiritual belief, wherever they're buried is where they need to stay. So some of them will stay there. And then there's the sad issue of the unknowns, kids that they didn't have good records for. The same thing in Chimawa. Those are just a couple of the boarding schools. There's how many of these other schools, have grave sites?
The third aspect of the major themes that arise in this book that you point out is the grief. And this is something that I personally was unprepared for when, I went to Carlisle for the first time. I just, it's something you hear about, you grow up with it, and every native person is affected by boarding schools in some way, even if they didn't have, ancestors that had gone. But it seemed to me that the grief was endless, and we simply cannot comprehend the amount and the magnitude of suffering. But, you point out in the introduction, but then also in the conclusion, there are ways of dealing with this. And I guess for me personally, one thing that's always frustrated me is that how can I grieve something that I don't even entirely understand?
It's called unresolved grief. And I think of my father in the My Healing Journey, the last chapter. I talk about showing a video in the white man's image to Papa. And at the end of the video, he just put his hands in his head and said, "So that's what the goddamn hell they were doing to us." So he died shortly after that. He was in 1994. He was 77 years old. So all of his life, he had no idea why they did to him what they did at that boarding school. And with the marching and the discipline there, he said when he joined World War II after the Pearl Harbor, he joined the army. He said the army was a piece of cake, compared to all the severe discipline and marching at the boarding school. So to me, that was his soul wound. You have a soul wound. We have a soul wound. And he was in unresolved grieving. I'm sure he was in PTSD from both boarding school and from the army, what he went through. So we're also in intergenerational trauma. So there's something called epigenetics that someone else will have to explain better, more than I can. But so my great grandmother, who I knew well, back in the 60s, she was almost 100 years old, and she was there. She lived in Cannonball. She was like a medicine woman there and used the water there. So I went down to No Dapple. But so she saw the Indian Wars and was put on reservations. And then she sent her 4 sons to boarding school. And then one of those sons, my grandfather, sent my mom to boarding school. So that's that epigenetics, that terror that's in her DNA is passed down to mama, to her father, mama, and to me. And have I passed that on to my children and grandchildren. And then there's the historical trauma of my great grandmother having gone through the Indian Wars. So we have a lot of trauma to deal with. Myself, I've gone through years of therapy, been diagnosed with PTSD. But I understand, Papa, and that's why my healing journey. So part of the healing, when I was up listening to the Willie Littlechild, Marie Wilson, and Chief Justice Murray up in Canada, Willie stood up one day after someone had testified, and he said, for forgiveness, we're nowhere near the reconciliation part. The United States isn't even in the truth-telling part yet. Canada did. he said, first of all, we have to forgive ourselves. And he was talking about an Indian man, a native man that told his story, and his kids were in the audience, and he just turned and was weeping and sobbing and saying, please forgive me. And that's the first time they had heard his story. So he was pleading with them to forgive him. But we have to forgive ourselves. So I had to forgive my father for how we were raised. We weren't sexually molested, but we were pretty physically and emotionally abused because of his alcoholism. So I went through a healing ceremony that I describe at the end of that chapter. And my father had already passed away, but it's like, I know he was there with me that day. So we still have a lot of healing as a nation. But, do our Native people even know that they're in intergenerational trauma or historical trauma? Those are terms I learned just in the 10 years I was doing this research. Did Papa know, I'm in intergenerational trauma. That's why I'm, the way I am. Well, no. So we need to reach out to our own people for healing. And I think in one of your questions you had asked, what does healing look like? There's a document you might be familiar with. It's called Triggers, and it's it comes out of the Native American Rights Fund. So I encourage you to look for it because it's packed. It's a 100-page document. It's packed with information and also with what healing may look like. It's called Trigger Points, Current State of Research on History, Impacts, and Healing Related to United States Indian Industrial Boarding School Policy. So some of like Canada, they funded 103 community-initiated programs, both on and off reserves and reserves. So what does healing look like for us here in the United States? It'd be similar programs that were funded up there. So we could use their models, but every community would have to come up with what healing looks like for that community. My community is about 95% Catholic. So maybe it would be a Catholic church ceremony, or many do both, sweat lodge ceremony, or, sun dancing, or shake tent, so every community would, but we need funding. Hopefully Deborah Holland's commission will look at funding specifically for boarding school healing in communities. We need to train therapists and psychiatrists. I was sick once with pneumonia, and my doctor also happened to be a psychologist. And I said, do you work with Native people here in Fargo? And he said, yeah. I said, do you know anything about boarding schools? Never heard of them. So here is a psychiatrist working with Native people in Fargo that didn't know anything about boarding school. And to me, it's an overarching issue of everything else that is traumatizing Native people, beside adverse child experiences and so on. So we need community-initiated programs both on and off the reservations. And what Trigger Points talks about are 3 pillars to healing. One is reclaiming our history, cultural interventions, and therapeutic healing. And that's what I've talked about here. So we also look at a wider view of healing through our language and education. We need culturally relevant curriculum. There's even people in Canada that I'm seeing on Facebook and some of that. They're saying, we didn't know that this was happening in Canada. We didn't know there was boarding schools. So I'm seeing that over and over and over when I go out and speak to college classes throughout the United States. I'll ask how many people I've heard about boarding schools, and usually no one will raise their hand. So we need increased economic opportunity. That. We need more research and scholarship. I've talked a lot about that today. We need focus on family programs, and we need focus on health and well-being. So those are some big issues that we need in general for our people, but specifically for boarding school healing.
And it goes without saying, land back.
Oh yeah, I love that T-shirt, land back. I'm wearing orange also for the Orange Shirt Day. It's Canada. There's a woman that did a children's book about orange shirt. So I know we've adopted that in Turtle Mountain at the community college. They also made orange shirts. So I think it may go nationwide to wear orange shirts for boarding school healing, which I love.
I have several more questions. One goes back to these kind of major themes, and one of the things that you identify is the sense of an inferior education, or the lack of an education that one did or didn't receive at these schools. And so, for example, like the way that the Carlisle industrial system was set up was that they would spend half the day in classroom and then half the day doing manual labor. And I think the best account of this was Luther Standing Bear. I think he was trained as a tinsmith. And he went back to the reservation. He's like, what use does this apply to my environment?
Yeah, that's why my dad, blacksmith and tinsmith and horseshoeing when he went back to and even farming. So there's a few boarding school people that did make a living at farming when they went back. Our reservation is tiny, 7 by 12. But most banks would not loan, Native people on the reservation money for farm implements, and the land was Shkunigan in our language. It's leftover land. It was a porous land, and so they were trained as farming and went home and, could make a living at that. But my father, we were poor, and then the other program that affected us, besides forced Christianity and forced assimilation, was relocation, and also termination. They tried to terminate our tribe in 1955, 56, and it was stopped by Louise Erdrich's grandfather. He was one of them, a tribal chair at that time, and her latest book that she won the Pulitzer Prize for talks about that. So Papa moved us out to Oregon, Portland, Oregon, because he needed to be able to make a living during the winter. You can't be a carpenter outside when it's 40 below zero. That's just the air temperature, not even the wind chill. So we moved out to Portland. He eked out a living there for us there. But we'd go home to the reservation whenever we could in summers. I loved it there. I had said that the minute I'm able to move back, I'm going to move back. So I did. Took the train back when I was 19, finished and got my teaching degree, and been there, been home ever since. So that's another program that affected Native people. And it didn't work. My parents came back. Dad started a business, his own carpentry business, wasn't successful. And then Mama did a lot of tribal history. So they both came back, and they both are buried there on the reservation. They both came back home. So, assimilation, didn't work with either of them by the end of their lives.
The goal of these policies was to actually destroy the tribal unit of the family, to disintegrate the tribe, the cohesion of the tribe, so that the tribes would be more susceptible to ceding land or to giving way. Because if you don't have strong families, you don't have a strong tribe, a strong nation of people. And boarding schools were in many ways a continuation of Indian child removal. And we know that at the height of the boarding school, boarding schools may have sort of declined in the amount of students that went to them, but the tactics shifted towards Indian child removal. So by 1969, you have 1 of 3 Native children adopted out, taken from their families. You have what you had just described, the kind of onslaught of termination policies. And some tribes did get terminated, like the Menominee got terminated, and they're still reeling from those impacts and the consequences of that. And then you have you have encouraged, I should say, or coerced relocation efforts to move people off the reservation, to, assimilate them into mainstream society, as if leaving the reservation makes somebody no longer Indian. And we know that that wasn't the case, because relocation in many ways fueled what we know today as the Red Power movement, but thinking in terms of where we're going with this conversation, and I was thinking about this today, I was thinking about it quite intensely, and I was like, what do we have in the United States in terms of, justice for Indigenous people that's comparable to this specific issue? And the only thing that I could think of that came close was the Cobell settlement, which took decades to resolve and encompassed, hundreds of millions of acres of land, as well as hundreds of billions of dollars in stolen assets or mismanaged assets. And the resolution of which, came about at the same time as a kind of whimpering apology from, not from the Obama administration necessarily, but from Congress. That wasn't a really sincere effort. And so I'm just like, part of me is extremely pessimistic, but then the other part of me knows that these things are historical and they take a lot of time and they take a lot of energy. I mean, Louise Cobell, God bless her, never even survived to see justice implemented, And yeah, that's just something that kind of bounces around in my head quite a bit.
Well, Canada, in 2008, there was an apology there. So when I was president of NABS, we kicked around as a board an apology, and we were split. And some of my people have said, my survivors have said, an apology, what would that do? I can't get my childhood back. And others have said it would be a validation of what hell we went through. The United States would recognize the boarding school era, and it would have to come from the United States government. And well, the churches, I know Canada's working on the Pope, or they're going to be meeting with the Pope, but that's a whole nother story of what happens there. But I'm for an apology. But again, just like what would healing look like for every community, what would an apology look like? So the churches in Canada, the Anglican Church especially, apologized. And when I was up there in Whitehorse, Yukon, I read their apology. And I can't remember what it says, but it is an apology. They apologized. So what would an apology look like if this current administration offered an apology? It would have to come from survivors. They'd have to be involved in writing that up or talking to whoever is going to issue the apology, hopefully from like President Biden. Obama at the time, because Canada did their apology very publicly. It went across all of the TV stations. I watched it. But there was a Native person that worked with Obama at the time, and they came and talked to NARF lawyers, and I was in on that conversation. And he said that Obama was told, if you apologize to the Native Americans, you're going to have to apologize to the Blacks. You have to apologize. Well, they already did to the Japanese. So he didn't make it public. It just got buried into, I think, an arms budget or something. So we've not had an apology from the government, but I would like to see some recognition. But whatever Deb Haaland is attempting to do, and it's a big issue. I don't know if she's going to set up a committee or this commission, or who's going to be involved, or how she's going to go about it. But it's probably going to take years. Maybe I'll pass away before. We're not looking for reparations like Canada did when we can't give so much money for everyone that went to a boarding school for so many years because of that statute of limitations. But what would reparations look like to Native boarding school survivors? I don't know. So, bless her. If I get invited or I have a chance to work with her, I would love to. So it's going to take time, and I'm anxious to see what she comes up with, but doggone it, it's a start. And like I said, we haven't even started telling the truth telling. So maybe this commission, this act will be a beginning of the truth telling for the United States boarding school, and a beginning of healing.
I mean, I sure hope so. I think, one thing that when I was doing this research, I never actually wanted to do it. It wasn't something that I sought out to do. And over time, it's become more necessary for me to do it. And it's like almost if I can't stop. And I think, I don't really know what to say other than that I'm committing, my time and energy to doing this now because it needs to be done. And, I just really want to thank you for the book that you published and caretaking those stories. I know that it's really difficult just from the brief amount of interviews that I've done with my own family and people that I've known. So it's incredibly difficult and taxing. And so I just really want to say thank you for that. But I also want to point out that you do more than just a work on boarding schools, and that you have books of poetry. You're an artist, you're a dancer, you do all kinds of things. And, I just really want to point that out. And
I have a children's book that just came out.
Yeah, exactly. So you're quite accomplished. Do you have anything that you want to plug as we conclude in terms of, resources people should check out? I'm going to put a link of your website, Denise Lajimodiere, .com in the show notes. But if there's anything else that you want to share or lift up before we conclude our conversation.
Yeah, well, look at the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They have a little button to donate to them. A lot of people are asking, what can we do? What can we do? And besides being an ally, and you can look up whatever ally means for non-native people yourselves, but donating money to the coalition would be greatly needed, and it is greatly needed. So donate to these. So NABS is one of the, we organized in 2011 with Native American Rights Fund. So we've been trying to get to this point since 2011. So it took our sister tribes in Canada across that medicine line to start the national attention for their people up in Canada. But also then they said, you better look at the United States. And the United States says, yeah, you better look at what's happening to us here. Yeah, so our only organization that we have here in the United States right now is the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. So, and they have a website and different resources that you can look up there.
And without that coalition, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation today. So I'll definitely include that. Denise, it's been really great to have you on. These are some serious topics. I'm sure this isn't the final word on any of this. But I do appreciate you taking the time, and everyone should check out your book. The title is Stringing Rosaries. It's published through I think it's NDSU Press, North Dakota State University.
North Dakota State University Press.
It's a very useful way. I shared it with my family. It helped kind of stir conversations, so I recommend everyone check it out.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation. I promised the survivors in the book, they asked me to please tell the world what happened to them. And I will keep telling the world what happened to them until I'm no longer able to speak. So thank you for this opportunity.